The body of a young waitress is found in the mountains of Colorado. With no physical link to the killer, the only hope of catching him is to decode his darkest secrets. To solve the murder, investigators must decipher a message written in blood. A young mother is the victim of an apparent suicide. Or is it a well-staged murder? To prove foul play, detectives will have to build a solid case from a flimsy square of plastic. The path from victim to killer is rarely clear. But with forensics as a guide, today's detectives can find the path to justice along the faintest trails of evidence. Rugged and isolated, the mountains of Colorado Springs, Colorado are a hiker's paradise. But those same qualities make it the perfect place to hide a body. On June 29, 1997, the El Paso County Sheriff's Department was called to a shallow grave. They unearthed the body of a young woman, but were unable to dig up any clues leading to her killer. Detectives could only speculate as to when their Jane Doe had been discarded and by whom. Detective Michelle Hodges knew she had little to work with.
The evidence that we had was very limited. We didn't know where she was killed at, and that normally is where the majority of your evidence is going to be found, and that very much hampered our investigation.
But they were able to give their Jane Doe a name. At autopsy, the body was positively identified as Deidre Malachowski, a 24-year-old waitress from the nearby town of Fountain. She had been reported missing a week before. The victim had been killed by repeated blows to the head with a blunt instrument. Biological evidence found during an internal examination of the victim suggested that she'd been raped. For now, it was the only physical evidence connecting Deidre to her killer. The body had been exposed to the elements and contained fly larvae. Investigators hoped that these insects would help pinpoint the time of death. At the Arapahoe County Crime Lab, detectives turned to Thomas Adair, an expert in forensic entomology.
Forensic entomology is the use of insects to answer a medical criminal question. Oftentimes this involves trying to determine how long a body has been exposed, how long it's been since females have laid eggs or larvae on the body.
In murder cases where a body has been dumped outdoors, adult female flies usually locate the remains within minutes and begin depositing eggs. These eggs help experts calculate how long the body has been exposed. At the crime scene, larval flies had been removed from the victim's remains and preserved in alcohol. At autopsy, a second sample of insects was removed and kept alive. These two sets of larvae were sent to the crime lab for analysis. One set would be used to identify the species that had colonized the body. The other would tell experts how long the victim had been dead. The first step was to rear the live flies to maturity.
In the rearing process, what we do is we take those immature species, the maggots, we place them in a jar with a food source, like in this case beef liver or chicken liver, and then allow them to progress to their adult stage. Once they've emerged, it allows us a little bit more ease in identification.
Once the species was identified, Adair was able to pinpoint the exact age of the preserved larvae found on the body. He determined that the larvae were at least a week old. Since Deidre Malachowski was last seen a week earlier, he deduced the victim had been killed within 24 hours of her disappearance. Now that she had a timeline to follow, Detective Hodges began questioning witnesses, starting with the person closest to the victim.
That person's going to give us the most information. Also, we need to either include or eliminate them from our investigation.
But in this case, the person closest to the victim, Deidre Malachowski's fiancé, wasn't talking. He hired an attorney and refused to cooperate with the investigation. Detectives visited Deidre's neighborhood and spoke to Donna Yerke, one of the victim's oldest friends. Both Yerke and her husband Alan expressed fears that Deidre's fiancé could have killed her. Deidre had told the Yerkes she had a violent confrontation with him the day before she disappeared.
During that fight, he had actually placed his hand around her throat in a strangling position to control her. This, of course, raised a lot of queries as to how heavily he was involved with that.
Given the violent nature of their relationship, investigators had to consider the fiancé as their prime suspect. But without any physical evidence, there was no way to pursue a case against him. And until more information surfaced, Hodges knew they'd have to be patient.
We only had a one-time shot at things like this. If you don't have enough evidence when you initially arrest, then you may not be able to proceed with the case. And we didn't want anything like that. We didn't want an acquittal in a case. We wanted a solid case.
But as the months wore on, investigators realized they might be waiting forever. In the interim, new cases demanded their attention. Almost 9 months to the day after Deidre Malachowski's unsolved murder, another body was found in the mountains. The young girl was fully clothed, but barefoot. Her shoes were found a few feet away. There were no obvious injuries to the body, nor any clues left behind by her killer. The victim was identified as Danielle Bonfield, a 12-year-old reported missing that morning. Danielle's body had been found more than 20 miles from her home. Considering the rugged terrain, investigators knew the girl couldn't have made it that far on foot. And whoever had driven her there left no clues. Nor was any evidence recovered from the victim's home. Leslie Bonfield, the girl's mother, had found nothing out of place. There was no sign of a struggle. Bonfield told investigators that on the night of her daughter's disappearance, Danielle was to stay home while she joined friends for drinks. By the time she returned later that evening, Danielle was gone. Detectives searched the area around the Bonfields' home and canvassed the immediate neighborhood. They came away empty-handed. The sheriff's department then traced phone calls made from the Bonfield home on the night of Danielle's disappearance. At 8:15 p.m., a call was made to a pager registered to one of the friends Leslie Bonfield was out drinking with. It was Alan Yerke.
And upon hearing Mr. Yerke's names, my ears naturally pricked up, and it was like, whoa, what are you talking about, Alan Yerke?
Alan Yerke, a witness from the Malachowski murder, had now surfaced on the periphery of the Bonfield murder. He was brought in for questioning. Yerke told police that he was out with Leslie Bonfield and some friends the night Bonfield's daughter disappeared. He said he received a page from Danielle at around 8 p.m. Instead of telling Leslie Bonfield about it, Yerke decided to leave the bar and look in on the girl himself. Yerke told investigators Danielle was fine when he left the house. There was reason to doubt his story, however. Yerke's criminal history revealed that the 29-year-old handyman and part-time computer technician had once been convicted of sexually assaulting his ex-roommate. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Yerke's car. It was impounded and analyzed by the Colorado Springs Police Department. The vehicle was littered with garbage, clothing, and papers. Criminalist Charles Green would have to process the mess with the precision of an archaeologist.
When we completed the photography, then of course we entered the vehicle. We had to enter that and remove items layer by layer, collecting any items that could possibly have evidentiary value. Mike, let's get this stuff out of here. You might check at the blood. I'm looking at the blood.
Beneath the piles of clutter, the car yielded 2 pieces of crucial evidence: Danielle's watch and her belt. The belt, investigators believed, may have been used to strangle her. Green found more menacing evidence as the search continued.
We discovered almost immediately blood pattern stains that were located on the front windshield. These blood patterns were quite definitive. Another group over here.
The pattern of the blood seemed to be the result of blunt force trauma.
We're doing a presumptive blood test here.
Swabs were taken and sent to the lab. These samples matched the victim's blood type. Alan Yerke was arrested for the murder of Danielle Bonfield. Having tied Yerke to the murder of the young girl, investigators now hoped they could find some link to Deidre Malachowski, the waitress found murdered 9 months earlier. Blood and DNA samples were taken from the suspect. They matched the fluid samples found in Malachowski's remains. Although investigators confronted Yerke with this damning evidence, he denied knowing anything about Deidre's murder. He also claimed he had slept with the victim several days before her disappearance, but that it had been consensual. Yerke just explained away any biological evidence they might find. Investigators would have to dig deeper.
Okay, I want to look at that too. Get some more bags.
Yerke's cluttered car yielded the pivotal clues in the Bonfield murder. They hoped that it would also contain some link to the Malachowski case. Hours were spent revisiting the vehicle and its contents, but not a single scrap of evidence relating to Deidre Malachowski was recovered. Nor were there any obvious clues in the trunk. Instead, technicians found it filled with computer disks and software.
John, I got this thing open a minute ago. So you want to take a look inside?
The trunkload of floppies and CD-ROMs hardly seemed a momentous find, but as today's detectives know, it could provide a treasure trove of evidence. Though traditional methods had failed to turn up any clues, this stash gave forensic specialist John St. Augustine a whole new hunting ground.
Computer forensics is important because we're coming across more media in more scenes now. It's no longer just, here's the bloody knife and the gun or the bullet. Now we're finding more and more pieces of digital media.
Altogether, 50 CD-ROMs and 400 to 500 floppy disks were seized from Yerke's car and home. The suspect's wife had mentioned that he liked to keep a journal. Though they knew it was a long shot, investigators needed to find out if he'd ever confessed his crimes electronically. St. Augustine had a tough road ahead of him. In order to preserve the integrity of the evidence, he had to copy every file found on every disk, the equivalent of an entire room filled floor to ceiling with paper. Next, he had to search through individual files, looking for anything associated with a crime.
I soon discovered a floppy containing the resume of Mr. Yerke, some jobs that he had worked at, as well as a file called My Sins. I attempted to open it by double-clicking on it, for lack of a better word, to open the file. Immediately, what came up was, this file is password protected.
He tried every method he knew to crack the code, but still couldn't penetrate Yerke's defense. It was obvious that whatever was in this document, Yerke had done everything to keep his sins hidden. Investigators in Colorado believed that Alan Yerke was responsible for the death of his wife's best friend. But without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, their only hope of solving the case was to hack an encrypted computer file entitled My Sins. With the help of some powerful software, John St. Augustine was finally able to obtain Yerke's secret password. God help.
When I entered the password, God help, into the My Sins document, immediately up came a screen that said, My Sins is reserved by Alan R. Yerke. Now I knew that Mr. Yerke was the author of this particular file.
St. Augustine was finally able to open the cryptic file. A list of Alan Yerke's crimes appeared on the screen, including the murders he'd committed. Perhaps more chilling was a list of murders he planned to commit in the future. Included in the list was the rape and murder of Deidre Malachowski. This on-screen confessional bore out investigators' suspicions. The man in their custody was a calculating predator whose appetite was only growing. Police surmised that Yerke picked up Deidre while she was waiting to catch a bus into town. He overpowered the young woman and killed her. Yerke then drove to the mountains, where he hid the young waitress's body. But the killer couldn't keep from confessing. Alone, in front of his computer, Yerke divulged his secrets. Had investigators not caught him when they did, Yerke's list of sins may have grown. Faced with this evidence, Yerke pled guilty to the murders of Danielle Bonfield and Deidre Malachowski. He is serving a life sentence plus 50 years without the possibility of parole. Without the skill of the forensics team, the path between Yerke and his victim would have been impossible to trace. In Texas, The trail was clearly marked in blood. Just off the Texas coast, the island of Galveston woos residents with 32 miles of Gulf beaches and balmy weather year-round. But like human nature, the wind and waves belie a furious capacity for violence. On a Saturday morning in June 1995, a Galveston man found some money on a suburban lawn. It was covered with blood. Searching for the source of the bloody bill, he noticed that the back door of a nearby building was open. The apartment inside was being renovated, but no one responded to his calls.
Miller! Hey, Miller! Hey, come on, Miller. Miller!
Inside, he found his neighbor, 32-year-old John Miller, dead. He'd been stabbed. Officers from the Galveston Police Department were called to the scene. Smears and spatters of blood marked the walls, ceiling, and floors of every room in the 5-bedroom apartment. Detective Norman Giles knew that these patterns could be crucial in solving the crime.
It was obvious initially we're going to have to collect blood and we're going to have to protect the crime scene. So most of our efforts initially were at protecting the integrity of the blood evidence that was going to be there.
Forensic experts were called in to photograph and diagram every single stain. Identification officer Gary Jones had never seen such a large amount of blood evidence at a single crime scene.
As soon as I walked in, I knew that this was going to be a rather extraordinary type case. There was virtually every conceivable type of bloodstain pattern incorporated into this one scene. Just the first visualization of that scene immediately told me I'm going to be here for quite a while due to the extent of the bloodshed that occurred during this struggle.
It appeared the victim had taken on more than one attacker. 3 distinct sets of footprints were marked in blood. One set matched the victim's boots. The second appeared to be prints made by a man's tennis shoes. A third set of smaller barefoot prints belonged to either a woman or a child. One of the barefoot prints contained sufficient ridge detail for identification purposes, should a suspect ever surface. This print was cut from the floor. Whoever was responsible for the murder had not emerged from the struggle unscathed. Droplets of blood found near the print suggested that he or she had been bleeding from the leg. Following the trail of blood droplets, investigators found what appeared to be the murder weapon, a 4-inch single-edged blade. The knife was taken into evidence, but all fingerprints had been wiped from its surface. The trail didn't stop there.
Blood went down the stairs, out to the road, then went south on the road to a parking lot near the seawall.
There, the path of blood disappeared into the water. With no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no apparent motive, the case ground to a halt. In speaking with friends of the victim, detectives learned that Miller was last seen the night before the murder at a neighborhood bar. A barmaid told police that Miller had been hanging out with a couple of drifters. The man was in his 30s, the woman in her 20s. Whether they were suspects or witnesses remained to be seen. But these vagrants could be anywhere by now. Without knowing their names, chances of finding them were slim. Investigators also learned that Miller owned a truck that was now missing.
We spoke with the family members that we could locate there at the scene, and nobody knew the location of the truck. So we thought that the truck was probably stolen at the time of the murder.
Although an all-points bulletin was issued on the missing pickup, it was nowhere to be found in the Galveston area. Several days later, Houston police reported they'd found the truck in a parking lot. They immediately arranged to have it returned to Galveston. Meanwhile, Giles canvassed businesses along the Houston highway where the truck had been found.
We came to a hotel along the way, and we went inside and checked with the clerk, and the clerk actually did remember seeing a male and female that fit the description of the persons that had been seen with Mr. Miller in Galveston. They said the female was walking. She appeared to be limping.
Police believed the woman had received the injury at John Miller's apartment. But even with a wounded leg, the couple managed to stay one step ahead of police. Identification officer Gary Jones was brought in to process the truck, which had just been towed back to Galveston. He wasn't optimistic about what he'd find.
One of the primary concerns that we had at that time was how much contamination had occurred to the vehicle during its transport and the time that it had been sitting idle in Houston.
Jones processed the truck for fingerprints. On one of the door handles, he found the impression of a single thumb. The print was lifted and submitted to a computerized fingerprint identification system. A week later, the system came back with a hit. The fingerprint belonged to a man who had been arrested just months before in Lubbock. His name was Charles Wayne Keese. He had a history of arrests for violent crimes. Linking Keese to the victim's vehicle was a positive step, but it only showed an association with the victim. It didn't prove Keese had done anything violent.
So we had Mr. Keese's fingerprints on the truck, but we knew he'd been in the truck on times other than the time of the murder.
Through food stamp records, police finally found Keese and his girlfriend in Lubbock, some 500 miles away. Armed with a warrant, detectives brought them to Galveston for questioning. Guilty or not, Keese and his girlfriend were among the last people to see John Miller alive. Investigators were eager to speak with them. While the girlfriend's footprints were taken, investigators turned their attention to Keese. Keese admitted that he and his girlfriend had hung out with Miller at a bar on the night in question. He said that Miller then drove them to a pool hall where his truck broke down. There, Keese said, they went their separate ways. His girlfriend's footprint had been compared to the bloody print found at the crime scene. The size of the prints was the same, but technicians would have to be more precise. Like fingerprints, toe prints have a unique pattern of loops and whorls that can be used for identification. Technicians compared the details of the crime scene toe prints with those taken from Keese's girlfriend. They matched perfectly.
We had her foot in blood in Mr. Miller's house, so we knew that she was there at the time of the murder.
Police confronted Keese with the footprint evidence and told him that they could prove he and his girlfriend were with Miller when he died. Keese then admitted that he'd stabbed Miller, but said that it was self-defense. He claimed Miller had been the aggressor. Police didn't believe that it would take brutal force for Keese to protect himself against an unarmed man. But without proof, it was possible that a jury might side with Keese. Galveston police faced a new hurdle. Unless the evidence could distinguish murder from self-defense, the suspect's word would prevail. The only hope for justice was to coax the victim's story from the trail he left in blood. Police in Galveston, Texas didn't believe Charles Keese's claim of self-defense. They thought he was a murderer. To prove it, they turned to the evidence.
The key to success in working a crime scene is being able to listen and understand what that crime scene is telling you. In this case, it involved listening to what was left by the victim in his own blood.
To illustrate the brutality of the murder and disprove the suspect's account, Jones needed to reconstruct the crime from the patterns of blood. Investigators found two distinct sets of shoe prints at the crime scene and one set of footprints. Using photographs as a reference, Jones traced each player's prints through a layout of the home. Jones theorized that Keese attacked Miller and pursued him to a corner of the room. The victim's boot prints were followed closely by Keese's tennis shoe prints. Keese's girlfriend got caught up in the struggle. Her bare footprints show that she ran out the back door. Miller's boot prints moved toward the front door. The killer's prints followed. Blood spatter on the door led police to suspect that the fatal blow was delivered as Miller tried to escape. He never made it. He slid down the wall and collapsed on the floor. Jones's reconstruction impugned Keese's self-defense plea and proved that Miller had been the victim of a vicious and unrelenting attack. Investigators believe that Miller offered the drifters a place to stay on the night in question. Possessive of his girlfriend, Keese flew into a jealous rage. He stabbed Miller while the unarmed victim fought to get away. Thanks to the detailed reconstruction of the crime, Charles Wayne Keese was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Charges against his girlfriend were dropped. At the crime scene in Texas, a confession was etched in blood. But the line between malice and misfortune isn't always so clear. On a Saturday evening in November 1987, paramedics responded to a 911 call from a rural Wisconsin home. Walter Reeder told the paramedics that his wife had shot herself in the bedroom. 21-year-old Paula Reeder was found face up on the floor, dead. She had a bullet wound in the side of her head. Reeder told paramedics that he'd found his hunting gun next to her body. He'd returned it to its case to keep it away from his small children. Detective Ken Peters of the Dodge County Sheriff's Department was assigned to the investigation. Though it appeared to be a suicide, Peters treats all violent deaths as homicides and works backwards.
Once you rule it a suicide and put it on paper, or you remove bodies and evidence, you cannot place that evidence or the body back there. You do a complete and thorough investigation, no matter how many hours it takes. And if you feel certain and you get a second opinion or even a third opinion from professionals that it is in fact a suicide, then you can live with yourself and you're comfortable with that.
But analyzing the crime scene only raised more questions. The position of the victim's body sent up red flags.
The history of these cases are like that you drop to the floor like a sack of potatoes as soon as you take a round to the head.
And yet, Paula Reeder was found with her head 3 inches under the footboard of the bed. It defied logic, unless something or someone had moved her. The condition of the weapons seemed odd as well. Because they're fired at such close range, guns used in suicides are normally covered in blood and tissue. The gun found in the Reeder house was relatively clean, with small amounts of blood on the barrel, butt, and grip. To determine who pulled the trigger, Peters asked for a gunmetal residue test. When a weapon is fired, it releases microscopic bits of metal onto the shooter's hand. Swabs taken from the hands of Paula and Walter Reeder were tested at the lab. Both of the Reeders tested positive, but in low levels. The inconclusive findings indicated they had both touched the gun. It didn't prove who fired it. Detective Peters brought Reeder in for questioning. Walter Reeder said that he and his daughter Misty were in the basement stacking wood when they heard a loud thump upstairs. He raced upstairs to the bedroom where he found Paula on the floor. When asked why his wife would want to kill herself, Reeder said he didn't know. Peters hoped he could find the answer that Walter Reeder couldn't supply. He went to talk to Paula's mother. Paula's mother told investigators that she had been worried about her daughter. At Paula's request, she had flown into Wisconsin the day before. She said that Paula and the children were going to leave Walter and return with her to Florida. It had been a bad marriage from the start. Against her mother's wishes, Paula married Walter when she was 16 and he was 40. Over the years, the relationship went from bad to worse.
Where are you going now?
Preliminary autopsy findings confirmed that Paula's health had declined. The once 110-pound woman weighed only 80 pounds at the time of her death. But a bad marriage doesn't prove murder. Without some substantial evidence of foul play, Paula Reeder's death would remain a mystery. Investigators in the Paula Reeder case were still not convinced that the young mother had killed herself. The pathologist confirmed that a single bullet killed the victim, but was unable to determine whether it had been suicide or homicide. If it was suicide, however, the entry point of the bullet was one of the most unusual investigators had ever seen. Most self-inflicted wounds are to the mouth or front of the head. In this case, the gun barrel had been placed behind the victim's ear, angled toward the back of her head. It defied logic and physics. Before she was buried, investigators measured the victim's limbs and did some calculations. Paula Reeder was 5 feet tall. Her arms were only 24 inches long. Factoring in the length of the gun, investigators determined her arm was barely long enough for her to press the weapon to her own head. The only way she could have fired it was if she had pulled the trigger with her thumb. Suspicions mounted, but investigators still lacked hard evidence. The evidence they did have only raised more questions. A hollow point bullet was removed from the victim's skull and sent to the lab. Analysis revealed something odd. A piece of plastic the size of a hard candy wrapper was adhered to the shell casing. Under the microscope, investigators could see that it was torn and stretched. They had never seen anything like it. Simulating the awkward way in which Paula Reeder would have to have held the gun, ballistics experts fired test rounds through different types of plastic. But unlike the sample recovered from the victim's head, these samples simply melted and burned. Experts could find no explanation for this phenomenon. Though they didn't have the physical evidence to prove murder, Detective Peters stayed in touch with the victim's family and friends, hoping some crucial testimony would eventually surface. The more he learned about Paula's relationship with Walter, the more he believed that her husband killed her. A number of letters Paula had written to friends and family spoke of Walter's abuse. She told friends that Walter actually showed her the bullets that would end her life. Just days before her death, she wrote, "I feel like I am going to be murdered." Despite the circumstantial evidence incriminating Walter Reeder, Detective Peters didn't have enough evidence to prove his case. His superiors called an end to the investigation.
Walter Reeder is a very convincing person, and the sheriff therefore came to me and asked that I close the case out on several occasions, which I would not do.
But Peters didn't have the final word. Without a clear determination of homicide from the pathologist, nor any conclusive evidence that Walter Reeder had pulled the trigger, the district attorney knew he couldn't get a criminal conviction. The case was closed. In rural Wisconsin, more than a year after her mysterious death, the Paula Reeder case was revisited. Newly elected Sheriff Stephen Fitzgerald met with Detective Peters.
Ken never felt comfortable with the suicide closure of this case and had always suspected that Mr. Reeder was more involved in this than we actually thought from the initial investigation.
Although the sheriff reopened the murder investigation, his department still lacked the evidence they needed to move the case forward. Dodge County detectives hoped they'd get the proof they needed from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. They scheduled a visit with forensic scientist Ken Olson.
So we asked that they bring the photos of the crime scene, the gun, the plastic that was recovered from the victim's head, and her clothing. So they brought that stuff out, and we had a meeting and went over the case.
The forensics team pored over the crime scene photographs, looking for some proof of murder in the blood spatter.
Well, we don't want to.
But as they studied the evidence, their attention quickly turned to the mysterious piece of plastic found on the murder bullet.
This plastic has a dome shape to it, like bubble pack does.
One of the scientists offhandedly observed that its domed shape resembled bubble wrap. At just the same moment, a colleague made a pivotal discovery. He had been carefully scrutinizing a photograph of the closet where the gun was stored. wads of bubble wrap were clearly visible.
And it was about that time I think we all thought, well, what happens if somebody tried to wrap bubble pack around a gun and make it act like a silencer? Could we get plastic to travel with the bullet?
If Walter Reeder wrapped the weapon before shooting his wife, it could explain how plastic became attached to the bullet. Investigators followed up on their hunch. At the time of the shooting, there were only 4 manufacturers making the kind of bubble wrap found in the Reeder's closet. Samples of each type of wrap were analyzed with an infrared spectrophotometer to ascertain their chemical composition. They compared these results with the plastic recovered from the victim. They found a match.
This would be the piece of plastic.
Color, thickness, and composition were identical. Hoping to prove that the plastic could travel with the bullet, technicians fashioned a silencer made of this particular bubble wrap. Finally, they were able to reproduce the odd discovery made at autopsy. The bubble wrap silencer explained how the square of plastic adhered to the bullet. To try and explain the lack of blood spatter on the gun, investigators did another test fire with the silencer, this time into a blood source.
We got the same type of patterns, or the lack of patterns, that we would have suspected that you would get by doing that. The gun was clean, the barrel was clean, there was no blood present on the gun. There was some void areas created from that, and that was consistent with what we had at the crime scene.
Police, open up!
You're under arrest.
With forensics results to support a murder charge, the case was finally strong enough to go to court. On October 29, 1991, nearly 2 years after the death of his wife, Walter Reeder was arrested.
I mean, it's not like you ever do anything about this.
Investigators believe that on the evening she died, Paula and Walter had an argument. Walter, angry that his wife was going to leave him, decided to end the marriage on his terms.
Why are you doing that?
Walter Reeder knocked his wife unconscious. He wrapped the weapon in plastic, placed it against his wife's head, and fired. Thanks to relentless detective work, the evidence persuaded the jury.
I can remember that day very vividly when we were all called back into the courtroom and the jury did hand down their decision. I was very relieved for the family, and also as an officer you always feel somewhat satisfied when you think that justice has been done.
By staging a suicide, Walter Reeder very nearly got away with murder. Bringing him to justice was well worth the years of frustration that led to his conviction. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Clever criminals try to stay one step ahead of police by concealing their tracks. But science gives law enforcement a jump start in their pursuit, helping police track killers along the faintest trails of evidence.